Je vous remercie pour votre présence et je vous prie de nous excuser pour le retard du début de cette conversation. Il s'agit de la tribune d'Afreximbank sous le thème « Vers plus de commerce intra-africain en 2025 ». La présentation va être faite par M. Amr Kamel, directeur des opérations bancaires Afreximbank, et le modérateur est M. Fabien Youbissi, Director of Structured Finance, BMO de la Banque de Montréal. Donc, sans plus tarder, j'invite M. Fabien Youbissi à commencer la présentation. Merci beaucoup. Vous pouvez l'accueillir avec vos applaudissements, bien entendu.
Bonsoir à tous et bienvenue encore une fois de plus à cette merveilleuse conférence Africa Forum. Donc, l'événement que nous allons suivre tout à l'heure, c'est la tribune d'Afreximbank. Et comme vous le savez, c'est un partenaire très important de Africa Forum. Et comme l'a souligné dans plusieurs intervenants, le commerce intra-africain est très faible. Très, très faible même. Il y a des légères progressions, mais ça reste encore très faible. La question qu'on se pose, c'est que peut faire l'Afrique pour améliorer sa situation? Comment Afreximbank, qui est une banque d'import-export, peut aider à promouvoir ce commerce intra-africain et quelles sont les mesures pour les années qui viennent? Et quand on parle de commerce intra-africain, quels produits? Qui sont les partenaires? So I'm very happy and honored to be with you guys here today and to have to introduce a very important person coming from Afreximbank. He's a very experienced banker with more than 30 years in the banking sector, spanning from, he had positions at JP Morgan, Bank of America, and currently Afreximbank, where he is director in charge of banking operations. So please help me welcome Mr. Amr Kamel.
Pardonnez-moi, j'ai oublié de mentionner que la présentation serait en anglais, comme vous l'avez constaté. Si vous avez besoin de traduction simultanée, je vous invite à aller à l'entrée pour chercher des écouteurs. Merci.
Good evening, everybody. Honorable dignitaries present here, excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked today to speak about a topic of towards increased intra-African trade by 2025, which is, as some of you who were here yesterday may have noticed, was mentioned several times in many of the panels and discussions, given really the importance and significance of intra-African trade for the continent, for the African continent. I'd even go as far as it being a matter of life or death for Africa. So it gives me a great pleasure to be able to speak on this topic, and especially the fact that it is a topic of prime importance for Afreximbank in particular. Maybe this way? It's not... Oh, okay. It started working? Okay. So what I'll be basically going through today is a quick introduction on the subject, and then speak a little bit about Afreximbank, since a lot of people don't understand or don't know what exactly Afreximbank is, and I don't blame them, because we're a bit of a sort of strange animal. And then touch a bit on the highlights of trade, inter-African trade currently, give some perspectives on what we think should be done, Africa should do basically to improve inter-African trade, and then talk a little bit about some of the products and initiatives that Afreximbank is taking to improve inter-African trade, and then finish with concluding remarks. So basically, African trade has grown significantly over the past decade, from 570 billion in 2005 to 1.3 trillion in 2014. However, that's still, unfortunately, that has not been good enough, because it still accounts to a marginal 3% of global trade. Now, what's even worse is that the share of intra-African trade is also quite low at about 12%. We believe that African countries should leverage their huge potential to foster intra-African trade by 2025. So, what is Afreximbank? We are a Pan-African trade finance institution created in 1993 on the concept of public-private partnership with a mandate basically to stimulate a consistent expansion, diversification, and development of African trade while working on commercial basis, and an underlying commercial basis here. Established under the auspices of the African Development Bank, we were conceived during the debt crisis of the 1980s, when many of the international financial institutions were pulling out of Africa or were providing trade finance at very exorbitant rates. So Afreximbank basically was developed to come in, and I'd like to acknowledge at this stage the presence of Mr. Abubakar Ndiaye, who was basically considered, or is considered, the founding father of Afreximbank, because he was working at the African Development Bank, he was heading the African Development Bank when the feasibility study for the bank was done, and he fought very strongly to have our bank created. So here we are and up and running. So Mr. Abubakar, can you please? Thank you. Okay, we're headquartered, as you can see, we're headquartered in Cairo, Egypt. We have 3 branches currently in Harare, Abuja, and very recently in Abidjan. And there's one that's being set up very soon in Nairobi. We have currently 38 participating states, but this is growing very quickly. We operate on based on a number of programs and facilities organized around 2 main schemes, which basically are trade, anyway, it's the trade expansion and diversification scheme, which is our typical bread and butter. And we also have an export development scheme, which concentrates more on value addition and diversification of products. We operate on the basis of strategic objectives and based on 5-year plans. And currently, based on the current 5-year plan, our main strategic objectives, as you can see, are promoting intra-African trade, as well as trade, South-South trade, basically. Facilitating high African value added in the continent's goods and services exports, especially those arising from extractive industries. Promoting improved access to trade finance in Africa, as well as facilitating transparency and efficiency in the conduct of Africa's commodity markets. Facilitating the creation of capacity among Africans on matters of international trade negotiations and trade finance. Now, in terms of where intra-African trade is today, as I mentioned, basically, as of 2014, the figure was about 12%, which obviously is very low when you look at other regions such as Europe, which is 73%, Asia 52%, and so on. However, when you look at the 2 graphs that are on the screen, there's a bit of good news which basically says that even though Africa's trade has weakened during the last 2 years because of weak commodity prices, slowdown in the global economy, and so forth, intra-African trade has actually been improving. Maybe mostly because of the concerted efforts by African governments to promote cross-border trade, as well as integration, regional integration, and diversification. But I'd also like to believe it's because of the efforts of Afreximbank during the last 20 years. So, what should Africa be doing to improve the intra-African trade? The first thing is to instate sensible economic reforms. For example, fostering structural transformation and value addition to overcome product concentration, which has been the main constraint to boosting inter-regional trade and poverty reduction in the region. Africa needs a strong political commitment and champions in order to scale up to scale up trade between its countries and deepen economic integration. Governments should put in place sustainable economic reforms for an enabling business environment and cooperate further to create a conducive and inducing environment for intra-African trade and also provide the much-needed trade facilitating infrastructure. Coherent and efficient long-term strategies for the continent, for instance, the allocation of appropriate budgets for the implementation of intra-African trade and development strategies, and then finally, removal of constraints to intra-African trade, such as the elimination of tariffs and so on. There is also a need for harmonization of regional trade agreements because despite the proliferation of regional agreements that have been put in place across the continent, their effectiveness to boost inter-African trade remains questionable. While the revival and deepening of some of those agreements is required, their harmonization across the continent would be more effective in addressing trade challenges over the medium and long term. In this context, ongoing efforts by the African Union to establish a continental free trade area is laudable. This will be an important milestone to enhance the process of structural transformation and boost inter-regional trade. The recent tripartite trade agreement, which was also mentioned yesterday, is also a very good step in the right direction. However, in a trade environment increasingly dominated by the culture of race to the bottom, establishing a free trade zone at the continental level will require even more political commitment and courage from African leaders. Another very important element is free movements of people and services, because free movement of people, of movements of capital and goods for fostering trade. In addition to the labor as a factor of production, free mobility would also allow cultural and social exchanges, which in turn would facilitate commercial exchanges. However, I think we have done pretty badly at that, and a good example, for example, is the opposition of Tanzania to the East African Community Initiative for Free Movement of Labor. Well, even though those three dimensions that I mentioned are important for the future of intra-African trade, there are also other things to consider. For example, competition. We'll obviously be facing stiff competition from many of the other regional blocs. Innovation is key. We need to innovate to be able to develop and sustain intra-African trade and compete effectively. And a coordinated strategy at the continental level should be implemented in order for the continent to have a unified approach and voice to trade negotiations. Okay, so now I'll go into the part I like most, which is what is Afreximbank doing about it? The role of Afreximbank in financing intra-African trade across the continent was instrumental over the last 2 decades, and especially during the period that followed the global financial and economic crisis, in which many international financial institutions withdrew from African trade finance markets. I mentioned in the panel discussions that our pipeline of transactions mushroomed from about 10 billion a few years back to 40 billion just because of the withdrawal of some of those financial institutions. In addition to trade finance, Afreximbank has contributed significantly in addressing the infrastructure challenges of the continent by financing trade facilitating infrastructure projects in many countries. At the same time, and reflecting the potential benefits of structural transformation for trade and mitigation of adverse terms of trade shocks, Afreximbank is also supporting export diversification through processing of export commodities and increased value addition. However, the trade finance gap in Africa is huge, and Afreximbank's efforts in addressing it alone still remains insufficient. So a concerted action between public and private sectors on the continent is required, as was the case at the global level when the G20 countries committed to provide 250 billion to support trade finance in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. We have developed a number of products to support intra-African trade. The first such product, which is clearly aimed at intra-African trade, is called the IntraFAP, which is Intra-African Trade Facilitation Program. Through this program, basically, the bank seeks to promote trade, economic cooperation, and regional integration by providing a platform for mobilizing financial, technical, and other resources for the development, promotion, and financing of intra-African trade. So basically, it's a mixture of financing as well as advisory services, market research, and policy advocacy, all aimed at in promoting and facilitating intra-African trade. Another innovative program that we call Contour, Construction Tourism Linked Relay Facility. This basically is in recognition of the economic contribution and development impact that tourism has on African economies, where we said, okay, as a trade finance institution, we do not know how to finance construction, and we do not want to finance construction. So we partner with a local bank, and we say, if for example, you have an investor who wants to build a hotel or any tourist outfit, then that local partner will finance it, and we, against a letter of credit or a standby letter of credit from Afreximbank, whereby once the construction of the building has been done and they deliver it within certain specifications, we will now take over the loan, pay the local bank, and refinance it there as a tourism project. This has, by the way, seen a lot of interest in many of the African countries because of the state of the hotel industries and tourist resorts that we have in Africa. We have also the export development program, which I won't go into detail because I already mentioned it before, but I said it's basically targeted at export manufacturing. And then we also have some of the special risk programs like the country risk guarantee and the investment guarantee that I also mentioned before, all aimed at making the risk perception of African countries more acceptable. Another program is the African Content Support Program, which is designed to increase the capture of value accruing to African countries from their extractive sectors by increasing the participation of African entities in these sectors. I mentioned before that this was one of our primary objectives at the beginning. And we've done quite a number of transactions for those, both in countries like Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, where basically indigenous firms are the ones doing the mining services mining services works basically in those mines. Again, another rather innovative product that I could think of was what we call AfriCoin, or this is Africa Cocoa Initiative. Again, I think yesterday somebody was mentioning, what we're doing for value addition, and he mentioned in particular cocoa. So I was smiling when he said that because I said, well, this is something that I'll be able to speak about. This initiative was designed as part of the bank's export development program to hasten the pace of industrialization of the continent by promoting value addition and end-to-end solutions to Africa's cocoa sector. So through the program, the bank basically provides cocoa bonds to support the planting of new trees and to promote consumption of cocoa products in Africa. The bank also provides term funding to support acquisition or expansion of existing capacity, all aimed basically for increasing the processing capacity of cocoa into liquor, cocoa butter, and the like, so that they can feed into the chocolate and manufacturing plants in Europe. Now, the German government, in recognition of the huge developmental effect of that program, basically gave Afreximbank a lot of support in terms of concessionary funding through the KfW, their development arm, as well as technical support for the implementation. And we've already done a few financings of this sort, and we hope, obviously it's still early days, but we hope if it succeeds, we'll be able to replicate it for other agricultural produce that are important for the continent. Okay, the Africa Diaspora Program. My moderator here yesterday, we were discussing, and he said, okay, what are you doing about the Africa Diaspora? So voila, that's what we have here. Basically, we've structured a lot of transactions around remittances that are coming from the African diaspora to their home countries, whereby we're able to sort of leverage, those foreign currency flows towards financing providing cheaper finance because of the certainty of the availability of foreign currency. So that's one element of it. We've also noticed that given the rapid growth in demand for trade in African ethnic foods and vegetables and also other products in Europe, the USA, and also I heard yesterday Canada, where the population of Africans in diaspora is growing considerably, the bank intends to facilitate the importation of such goods by supporting players in the supply chain. Finally, mobile banking. There's no doubt that mobile banking has become one of the most important tools for the conduct of global business recently. And Afreximbank is currently working with a Pan-African mobile network operator to develop a cross-border trade platform with the objective of fostering intra-African trade. Africa has 650 million phone subscribers, more than the USA or the EU. And mobile payment system was developed in Kenya, M-Pesa, if somebody heard of it. So Africa has become a leading market in the world for mobile money and banking. We believe that if we're able, this is still work in progress, by the way, it hasn't yet materialized. We're still developing it, but we believe that if we're able to roll it out properly, there'll be immense benefits for intra-African trade, especially improving access of the informal sector to the financial services, boosting intra-African remittances in support of inter-regional trade, and most importantly, formalizing the huge market of intra-African informal trade, estimated at about 100 billion or 60% of intra-African trade. Now, those basically were some of the products. Obviously, I couldn't talk about all the products that we're dealing with, but those are some of the products that were particularly aimed at intra-African trade or facilitation. Now, how do we roll out those things? Being a triple P product ourselves, a public-private partnership, we basically always work on the concept of cooperation rather than competition. So we cooperate with everybody, with the local banks, with the international banks, with the multilateral organizations, governments, basically you name it. For example, for the local banks, we consider them as straight finance intermediaries through which we channel many of our services by giving them lines of credit, or they act as agents for some of our facilities. Our portfolio currently, we have about 30% of our portfolio in lines of credit. There's also African governments and central banks, as I mentioned. And again, recently we have introduced a new product called the Central Bank Deposit Investment Program for the purposes of tapping part of the continent's growing external reserves to support intra-African trade. Under this program, we have something called the National Export Support Account, which is a special account that the central bank would open with us, which has surplus external reserves to be used for the purpose of pre-financing national exports in other African countries. Then we have obviously the international financial institutions, the export credit agencies, and development finance institutions, with whom basically we do a lot of syndications and club deals. I mentioned yesterday that we've been able to leverage $6.1 million for each dollar that we've invested, and we had invested about $30 billion since inception. $5 billion since inception, which translates to about $30 billion of transactions that were done in different African countries. We also have facilities under the ECA and DFI programs in excess of $1.1 billion, as I mentioned recently. Now, to dramatize the importance or significance we are giving on intra-African trade, we have recently launched a 500 million Egypt-Africa trade promotion program. Now, the idea basically was we looked at some of the big economies in Africa, and we said that we want to look at where they have competitive advantages in certain industries and services, and we will target those services and industries and try to help them basically export their services to other African countries. And the pilot plan was done for Egypt. I was happy to hear yesterday that the African Development Bank was also is going to partner with us to that, so we'll probably be able to increase it to about $1 billion, basically depending on the uptake. We have also other non-credit initiatives. For example, in 2011, the ADB and the World Trade Organization requested the bank to lead the effort to involve the African private sector in trade policy formulation and international trade negotiations. This led to the creation of the Pan-African Private Sector Trade Policy Committee, otherwise known as PAFTRAC, to which the bank, Afreximbank, provides a secretariat. In 2012, the African Union assigned Afreximbank the role of leading the effort to provide the financing needed to boost intra-African trade under the AU's plan for increased inter-regional trade. We've also initiated mobilization of peers in Africa to form the Alliance of African International Finance Institutions, which aims at creating an online platform for sharing of risks and information amongst members, as well as lobbying platform. We have some capacity building initiatives also that we're working on, as well as contributing to literature in the form of providing statistics, providing trade information, and so on. So, to conclude, the future of African trade will depend on the commitment and capacity of the African leaders to respond to the growing challenges, but also important opportunities for the continent. A concerted approach on the African trade agenda is needed to accelerate the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area's negotiations, close the African infrastructure deficits required to expand commerce at national levels and deepen inter-regional trade, deepen the process of structural transformation with a view of accelerating trade diversification and boosting intra-regional trade. Afreximbank, on its part, is using all its means towards achieving one of its prime objectives of increasing intra-African trade, and we welcome any working with any partners, or we're willing to assist any initiatives towards fulfilling that goal. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Donc, désolé, je pense que je parle un peu plus fort là. Donc, depuis hier, nous parlons de productivité en Afrique. Nous avons parlé de commerce intra-africain. Une dimension importante quand on parle du commerce, c'est d'abord la rencontre de deux ou plus de deux personnes, et ils doivent se rencontrer sur un produit ou un service. Je pense qu'on a parlé beaucoup de l'Afrique qui exporte ses matières premières à l'état brut, pratiquement sans transformer. Je me rends compte aussi que très peu de pays africains ont des structures pour transformer ces produits. Donc, quand on parle même de commerce intra-africain, si au Cameroun on produit peut-être du pétrole, où est-ce qu'on le raffine? S'il n'y a pas de raffinerie suffisante en Afrique, il y a des chances qu'elle va sortir de l'Afrique. Le cacao, c'est un bon exemple. Très récemment, on a commencé à voir sur le continent des structures pour transformer le cacao. Merci encore à vous d'avoir aidé la mise en place de cette structure en Côte d'Ivoire, par exemple. Donc, ces sociétés de transformation de matières premières qui ajoutent de la valeur à nos produits sont tellement importantes parce que sinon, le produit qui sort naturel, là, il n'y a pas un endroit où on va le commercialiser en Afrique. Essentiellement, les seuls endroits où on peut les commercialiser, c'est dans les autres pays qui ont des structures pour les transformer. So, I mean, my question to you basically is, what are the best partners in Africa now to do commerce between themselves, and what product can they commerce on, can they do the trade on? Because it seems to me that raw materials, again, not many of our countries can really transform them. So if I produce a raw material from place A, there's no place B I can even, sell it to, or because they can even transform it and resell it in the open market. We cannot transform it in the local country where it's produced. There's no other country in Africa that can transform it. So it has to get out of Africa to be transformed. So the big question is really, how do we, get out of that? I mean, you guys have started, but I want you to elaborate more on that.
Yeah, sorry. Obviously, you have to create capacity in different areas, but that is actually starting, and we are seeing some countries that are actually importing or exporting between each other in capacity. For example, you have oil that Nigeria has an abundance of, okay, and it can export it to Cote d'Ivoire, which has a big oil processing plant. You have, for example, when you start producing cocoa processing plants in Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana, they can also export to other African countries that will maybe start putting up chocolate factories and things like that. So, and we have seen a lot of big players now expanding in different African countries like the Dangotes. We've seen, for example, Sweden in Egypt, who's doing a lot of power projects in different African countries. I think he's done about maybe in 8 or 9 different African countries, very big projects that I'm aware of. So I think we're starting to get there. And the only thing is that, unfortunately, previously we had a lack of trust in each other. I remember when I first joined Afreximbank, if you want to get from one country to the other, that's just next door. You probably have to go through Europe. Yeah. That is changing now. Things have changed considerably. You have Ethiopian Airlines, you have Kenya Airways, the likes that are coming up and filling in those gaps and making connectivity much better. So I don't think it's only a matter of lack of processing capacities or things, but it's also a matter of lack of trust that was previously there.
And many of our previous panelists spoke about, or even questions that we had from the crowd during these few days, were a lot about currencies as well. Mm-hmm. So I believe that if you want to trade with another country, you guys need to trade in a particular currency. So in Central Africa or in CFA zone, they have the CFA. In Nigeria, you have Naira. I mean, many of those countries have different currencies. In many cases, because of legislations, they cannot even exchange their currencies between themselves. So how is that impacting?
Yeah, that is a very, very valid point, and thank you for raising that. And one of the reasons we want to go into that mobile banking, because we think that we'll be able basically to rely mostly on just local currencies and offset them against each other. We will try and set up some sort of a reconciliation thing and try and address that. But clearly it is a problem, but it needs to be worked on. And and innovation basically is a solution. And hopefully mobile banking will achieve part of that. But thank you.
Any questions in the?
Yeah.
Okay.
French or English?
Okay, Gervais Malam, president of Jaram Communication and editor of Afreximbank magazine and Africa Trade. I would like you to tell us more about extra-African trade. What Afreximbank really do for instance, Canadian companies who have commercial relations with African companies, enterprises. How do you help them to have commercial relations? And yesterday I heard the representative of Export Development Canada saying that you are working together.
Yes.
And can you tell us more about that?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, obviously, I mean, I was focusing mostly today on intra-African trade, but we do support a lot of trade in general, okay? The Export Development Program, for example, that I just quickly went through, is geared towards importation of capital equipment and things that would generate processed goods. So those basically come from, advanced countries like Canada and the like, and that's where we work with people like EDC, to support this kind of importation and to provide reasonable coverages that they will provide some guarantees and things like that, and we get some DFIs also to provide term lending, because as a trade finance institution we can only go up to 7 years. That's the maximum we can do, but we partner with some of those to help that. We also provide a lot of sort of credit risk guarantees, country risk, for example. I also mentioned yesterday the investment guarantees. They're all targeted basically to make any investor or someone doing business in Africa making it more acceptable for him as a country risk. I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Looks like there's one. Okay.
This is about the informal part of the business. Why the informal part would go into a structured approach of the commerce, because the informal part of the business is to escape from the taxes, is to escape from the monitoring of the figures, and the way they should and could exchange in cross-border trade, in my mind, would go directly to virtual currencies such as bitcoins or such as other virtual currencies in which the banks still aren't. So how do you mind about converting 100 billion informal business into a structured business in a banking system?
Yeah, thank you very much. Obviously, it's not an easy thing, and we know we have a humongous task in front of us. But not all of the trade is just to avoid taxes. A lot of it is just basically because there's no infrastructure for it. So somebody would just carry a bit of money, go across the border, get some products, and just go back and sell it. So it's not that he's trying to avoid taxes so much as he's trying. He doesn't have the means to do otherwise. So if you create that platform for him, it makes things much easier, right? Instead of carrying the cash and the risk of carrying the cash and going cross-border and stuff like that, we will have like delivery points that they will deliver, and it will be secured under a certain umbrella. And that's one part. The other part will be working with governments to make sure that the tariffs are removed. I mean, there are a lot of free trade, so-called free trade areas between many of the African countries, but in practice it's not really being implemented that much. So it's really making sure that the governments really abide by that, and so that there's, like you rightly said, people will not avoid those tariffs. So it's a lot of work, but hopefully we'll get there sometime. We hope that we'll be able to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's about time for us to thank you very much for your presentation again, and thank you for coming.